Hello, and welcome to Charted, an astrology podcast. My name's James, and today we're going to talk about the fourth house in astrology. So the fourth house is going to be the second angle or angular house that we look at. And before we dive in, I do want to make one note of something. So on this podcast, I look at things in the whole sign system. I think for the most part, it is, I don't want to say how astrology was originally formulated, but it was certainly the easiest way when they first started going through things because it's very mathematically straightforward. It's also very logical, the system and how it's framed and how it works out and how everything fits neatly together. But that's what I use because I have found in practice it to be the most effective, at least for my own practice that I do. That's not to say other house systems can't be used, but as we look through things, right, keep in mind we're using a whole sign perspective. Now, that said, the ascendant is always going to mark the first house, right? Because that's the starting point. In a whole sign system, that ascendant will float within the first house, but it will always be inside the first house somewhere. For any of the quadrant house systems, right, they use the ascendant as the cusp, that is the starting point of the house, and then go from there. In the whole sign system, the midheaven and the IC, right, float. They can be in pretty much any house, with the midheaven being above the horizon and the IC being below the horizon. They float relative to where you're at on the earth and relative to the time of day and to the time of the year. So they change a lot, and there's a lot of variation to where they can be at any one given time. The higher or lower, or I guess farther north or south you are on the planet, the more deviation towards the ascendant and descendant that the IC and the MC will have, which can lead to a lot of interesting scenarios where if you're looking at a chart in whole sign, you can have your IC in, say, the fifth or the third house or even the second house. Whereas in a quadrant system, like using Placidus, the fourth house cusp, that is the starting point of the fourth house, is always marked by the IC. So you get a weird situation where your fourth house can be a totally different sign than what it is in whole sign. And so I want to make that distinction that the IC itself is not always in your fourth house as we look at it from the whole sign perspective, but the IC is kind of the depths of that house, right? It's associated with it. And so the fourth house in general, as well as the IC, are going to share the same meanings if the IC is in a different house than your fourth. Again, from the whole sign perspective, it's going to add in an extra layer of nuance, which I don't really want to discuss on this podcast, or at least this episode. So wanted to get that out of the way because it is important. If you're looking at things through, like I said, through Placidus or something else, this is where the houses kind of get irregular and funny and kind of weird. And so just for the sake of clarity, I want to make sure that we understand we're looking at things through the whole sign lens. And that the IC, even though I referenced that, may or may not be in your fourth house specifically. So let's dive in then. What's the fourth house about? Well, if we look at it astronomically, that is from a perspective, visual perspective. Where is it? Well, very obviously, it's below our feet, right? It's the deepest part of the chart. It is as straight down as you can go, right? So it is the kind of the midway point around the opposite side of the earth between the horizons, right? The eastern and western horizon. So that implies that two things. Number one, it's going to be the least visible part of your chart, least visible to the outside world, I should say. And it is going to be, right, personal because it's under the horizon. All the houses under the horizon have a personal element to them. Second thing is the fourth house is in a square relationship to the ascendant, to the first house, What does that mean? A square is an aspect of tension. It is a 90-degree angle. It is two houses, two signs that want to do things in totally different ways. And so that brings in frustration, it brings in conflict, it brings in tension. And so what that means is aspects of tension, the square aspect brings up tension between the two houses, between the two signs, or the two planets, whatever it is you're looking at, and requires adjustment. So the first house being square to the fourth means that there is always going to be tension between those areas of life, and therefore is going to imply that both are going to force the other to adjust at different times. And that'll make sense as we kind of explain the meanings. The last thing for the fourth house is it is does not have any planets in its joy. Right? We saw this with the second house. The angles actually don't have any planets in their joy, with the exception of the first, which has Mercury. So there's no planets in their joy in the fourth. It's below the horizon. It's the deepest point of the chart and is square to the ascendant. And then lastly, it is an angular house, right? So it's part of the fourth house triad. Makes sense, right? It's the angular part of that. Angular houses are going to be more active, more potent. They're more important in terms of who you are. They're just very prominent areas of life. So even if you don't have planets in your fourth house, they will always be very important in terms of your kind of life path, life growth, determining who you are and how you are. They'll always be important. They'll always be active areas of your life. And that'll make sense as we go through this. So when we put all this together, what do we get? Well, the main thing, and really the kind of the summation of everything that it all stems out from, is the fourth house is going to represent privacy, our private life. As I said, it is the deepest part of the chart, with the angle exactly, the specific angle, the IC, being that kind of very deepest point. Be like right, if the fourth house kind of represents the bottom of the ocean, the IC itself kind of represents like the Marianas Trench, right? That deepest part of the deepest part. But the fourth house is completely private, right? It's the most private part of the chart. Why? It's under the horizons where you can't see it, or where the rest of the world can't see it. And it's very personal. And so there's layers to this. So let's unpack it. We'll start with the deepest layer. So what's the most private that you can be in life? And that's going to be in your own head, right? In your own mind, in your own brain, inside your own thinking, conscious self. Because when you're inside your own head, right? When you're in your own little world in there, thinking, imagining, feeling, whatever it is, daydreaming, nobody else can see that. Nobody else has access to that. It is truly private, right? Until we come up with technology to read minds, which, maybe we do, maybe we don't, sometime in the distant future, I don't know. But until such a time as that happens, the only place where we have true safety from others, true privacy, where no one else can see what's going on, what we're doing, who we are, is when we're in the privacy of our own head. And for some people, that's terrifying. For some people, that's fantastic. But the fourth house is going to represent that internal world because it's the most private place. So what does that imply? Well, that means the fourth house is going to represent how we think about things. And it's a very conscious house. I want to make note of that because it's a square aspect to the first house, which represents the house of self. So the self can see this part of our life, which means it's about our conscious mind. When we look at some of the other houses in their relation to the fourth, we will look at the other two kind of psychological houses. But the fourth house, as part of the psychological houses, is the conscious psychology. It's the conscious mind. So it's how we're thinking about things, how we're processing things. I think processing is a really good word for the kind of the what the fourth house is about mentally. It's how we process thought, how we process emotions, how we process external stimuli. And the moon, as we know, as we've discussed in previous episode, is about emotions. It's about the mind. But the moon is subconscious, mostly. So while the fourth house has kind of a resonance there, the moon is much more about our subconscious things that kind of bubble up from below. The fourth house is not about that. It's about our current awake mind. So the fourth house is going to be how we process things. It's going to be how we think about things, the way in which we think about things, the way in which our mind tends to operate. It's also going to be how we process emotions. And so this is going to tie into our moon as well. You'd want to look at both to really get a sense for how does somebody kind of process things as they run into stuff in life. It's also going to show, right, how we tend to handle things kind of in our own internal world. Are we very vibrant? Are we very motivated? Or are we very peaceful? The fourth house in a lot of ways is kind of our underlying motivation for things, right? The drive that we have that kind of pushes us to do certain things. To give an example of what I mean by this, let's look at a Capricorn rising. If you look at Capricorn, one of the things you'll notice if you watch one is on the one hand, it's ruled by Saturn. Most Capricorn risings are very diligent and disciplined. And you'll notice they don't mind taking their time with things. So they have a reputation for patience, playing the long game to get what needs to be done. But if you watch them on a day-to-day basis, what you notice is they actually are very impatient to get things going. I have duties, I have responsibilities, I want to get started. So the impatience of a Capricorn comes out in that they have a lot on their mind to do, to get going. They want to start, they want to get building because they know it's a long journey. Where does that come from? It comes from the fourth house being Aries. Right? Aries is impatient. Aries wants to start and wants to go. I'm got an impulse. So what does that mean for a Capricorn? It means that the internal motivation is to begin, get started, get this thing going. I have to go. All right? And then the patience comes through in some of their other things if you look at their chart. But that internal motivation, though, is to get started. So that's kind of how what I meant by it shows how we internally are driven towards things. So what's the next layer up then in terms of our privacy? Well, obviously the next step outward from the mind is going to be our person, and specifically our person when we're kind of in our private spaces, right? What are our private spaces? Well, it could just be when you're alone, say in a park or wherever. But more specifically, it's going to be, quote, the, quote, safest place in your life, which in theory should be your home, right? Physically, the safest place you can be. Physically, the place where you can let down your guard and kind of be at peace, at least ideally. So the home then is going to be the next layer out of privacy. And by extension, then it's going to be the people that we let into our home, so which means our family. So the fourth house is going to be our home in the very physical sense, but it's also going to be the places that we make our home, the places where we feel comfortable to be ourselves, right? Where we are essentially acting as who we are in our own private little space, which again, you tend to notice who somebody is, how they act in their kind of own privacy based on their fourth house. They'll tend to act out that sign a little more and those planets a little more when they're kind of in their own little private place. Now, one other thing is you can have places that you consider like a home away from home, for example, or a place that feels like home. Maybe it's an art studio that you're a part of, right? It's just a place that's very special, has meaning, whatever it is, a place that you frequent constantly. Or maybe it's a private little place in a park that you found, a little grove maybe, or maybe somewhere up on top of a mountain. I don't know, whatever it is, but some place where you do feel kind of, hey, this is my own private little space, right? So fourth house is going to represent those kinds of things. Now, that's going to tie into the 12th house a tiny bit, because 12th house is going to represent solitude as one of its meanings, and we'll get there. So it's not entirely any place you feel alone, but it's any place you feel private to the extent that you can kind of just be your natural self. Because when you are in private, when you don't feel like there's anybody watching, we tend to operate in a lot of ways more of our true self, more of who we actually are. That tends to flow out a little easier. Why? Because you have all the guards we put up because of social pressures, right? Worldly issues, stresses from the outside world. We tend to, okay, those are gone. I can relax a little. And the fourth house kind of, again, governs how we handle a lot of that stuff consciously. How we handle those stresses, what we do with them when we're ready to kind of put them away, forget about them for a little bit. So the fourth house is going to represent private spaces, but it's going to represent our home, because a home should be that place that you kind of go back to, right? It's your home base. It's the place where you live, where you sleep, right? Which is a very vulnerable place, which is why it's private. You don't want to expose yourself to the outside world where you live, where you eat, where you sleep. So it's going to represent then the place that you live, the place that you grew up in, because you were part of somebody else's family. And it's going to represent your own family, both the family you grew up with and the family that you eventually create. And there's some nuance here, because family is kind of seen in a couple places in the chart. We already talked about this in the episode on the second house. Right? The second house represents support systems, which means it's going to be the people that you support, that support you, which a lot of times is going to be your family. Not always, right? It's common that people don't have very supportive families, but people do have supportive families too. So family can be, in the support sense, the second house. Siblings, extended family is the third house, as we talked about in the last episode. So what family is it then that is the fourth house? Well, the fourth house is going to represent the family that raised you. It was the home and family life that you had growing up. So this could be your biological parents, and most of the time it's going to be one or both of them. Because again, it represents that home life and who was there. But it could be the people that raised you who weren't your biological parents. Maybe you were raised by an aunt and uncle, a grandparent. Maybe you were adopted. Maybe you were raised by family friends, right? Depending on your circumstance. It could be a lot of different reasons for why it wasn't your biological parents. But the fourth house is going to show who they were, how they operated, how they kept the atmosphere of that home. What was the condition? What was the life like growing up? It's going to be seen by our fourth house. And the reason that this ties in so nicely with the fourth house representing our mind, right? The way we process and the way we kind of consciously think and react, is because the way in which we are raised is going to have tremendous, monstrous effect on who we are and how we operate. When you are a child, right? Children pick up things both consciously and subconsciously. They're like sponges. Why? Because they're trying to learn, right? They're not an adult yet. They don't know how to operate in the world. And so what do? Their brains are soaking up everything. So they learn how do I survive? It's the number one thing. How do I survive? Right? So that's what their brains are constantly doing. And so the atmosphere that a child grows up in is in a lot of ways the kind of stimuli, the setting in which their brain kind of initially adapts. So the fourth house is going to show that situation. So if you have a tough fourth house, most of the time it's because you grew up in a tough family life. And you might have had loving parents, but there may have been things that were emotionally, physically, right, difficult. So the fourth house is going to show a lot of that dynamic you had growing up, and therefore it's going to influence the dynamic you have internally, why you think the way you do. In a lot of ways, it's shaped by your parents. You pick up their mannerisms, you pick up their habits, you pick up their things, whether consciously or subconsciously. The subconscious part's going to play into that a lot as well. And the fourth house isn't the only thing. You obviously got to look at the planets, where they're at, because that influences things a lot, especially the moon. But the fourth house is going to show this family dynamic. It's going to show the family stuff there. Now, one other thing is, because it's showing how your family raised you and the traditions, the mannerisms, the hang-ups, the good, the bad, that they kind of ingrained in you, whether for better or for worse, right? That means it's like what they're passing down to you, right? It's their lineage, which by extension, we could say it's what their parents passed down to them, and their parents' parents, right? And their grandparents and their great-grandparents, and so on and so on and so on. So the fourth house is going to represent then our lineage, not just our family, our immediate family, but it's the family lineage. It's the family history. And something that's interesting with this is that if you look at families over go back several generations, you tend to notice patterns within the families. They tend to struggle with the same things or excel in the same things. Why? Because they pass on those same things to each generation. And so each generation is constantly learning, right? Especially as when you look at ancient times, when things were more self-contained. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have easy access to knowledge way back in the day. So the majority of what you learned and how you operated was passed down from your parents, which was passed down from their parents, and so on and so on. And so the fourth house is going to have a strong attunement to our family history, our ancestors, our lineage. So if you have a strong fourth house, or you have an emphasis on the fourth house, a lot of times ancestral work or genealogy, perhaps, is going to be something you find either intriguing, important, has a theme in your life in some way. It's very common for people with like the sun or the moon in the fourth house to have a strong attachment to their family history, right? Maybe not necessarily themes that were passed down, but oftentimes it can just even be as simple as just a very strong love for, learning all that stuff and passing it out down to their own children. But lineage is going to be a big piece of this too. Now, the fourth house is also going to represent the family that you create, right? If we look at the fourth house triad, we have the cadent house, which is the third, so siblings, neighborhood. It's the local space. It's the thing that kind of comes before. And if you think about it, first you're finding the locale, and then you're finding the home, and then within the home you have yourself who's in their own head, right? That's kind of the drilling down to the very private. But on the other side, we'll talk about this in the next episode, the fifth house. Fifth house is going to represent children. It's kind of what comes from a family, right? What do you do when you become an adult? You go out into the world, at least in theory, right? We go out into the world, we get a job, we do what we're doing, right? We have a career, we have hobbies, we have things we're into. We meet people, we meet friends, we eventually maybe get married or just date, whatever it is. And you meet people and you have them join part of your life, and maybe eventually, right, you find a partner. And with that partner, you eventually start your own family. You move in together. Maybe you get married, maybe you don't. And then eventually maybe you have kids, right? And so kids is what comes from having a family, right? And that's the fifth house. We'll talk about that more next week. So the fourth house represent kids? No, it doesn't. It represents the family itself, the family unit. But the kids specifically are going to be the fifth house, much like the third house is going to represent extended family specifically, even if they are part of your lineage. So the fourth house is going to represent the family you create, right? Once you're an adult, once you move out into the world, it's going to represent that family that you create. It's not going to represent your spouse so much as just the family unit as a whole, right? Once you have that. And it's going to represent then the home that you live in, that you go out and move out from your parents' house, out into the homes that you live in, right? Maybe you move several times, maybe you have one place you live, whatever the circumstances are. And it's going to show your approach to how you handle your new home, how you handle your new family, right? The one that you've created. And the thing that's interesting about this, and this is why lineage, I think, is such a big thing here, is you're going to have the same house, right? The same sign, the same planets for both the home you grow up in as well as the one you create. And you might think, well, I'm going to do things differently. I grew up in a broken home. I'm doing things very differently. And that's probably true. But that doesn't mean a lot of the underlying themes go away. So let's go back to our example of Capricorn so I can kind of explain this. Capricorn rising, one of the harder rising signs, admittedly. Probably one of the hardest, actually. And the reason is because they grew up in a home where it's Aries rising. Aries is full of passion. It's impatient. It wants to go. It's vibrant, but it's also can be selfish. And it can be very quick to anger. And it can be conflicting. Right? It's warrior. And the thing with Capricorn rising is it grew up, the family life growing up is such that it was forced to do what? To do things for itself. Aries, more than any other sign, is focused and oriented around self-actualization. Let me do it. I have to do this thing. I want to do this thing. Right? I want to create it. I'm going to go. I'm going to be. I'm going to exist. And so for Capricorn rising, they grew up in a home life that was self-oriented. Maybe it was every man for himself. And even if it wasn't a just total chaotic mess, right? Maybe they did have very loving parents, but usually, even in the best of homes, you have somebody, if they're a Capricorn rising, who grew up in a situation where they kind of had to fend for themselves. They had to learn to do it themselves at a much earlier age than they were probably ready for. Because that's what Aries does. It does it itself. It just dives in. And so as an adult then, they're going to mimic a lot of those same things, but, and this is where you can have both good and bad. When we look at the difficulties in our charts and we try to heal the things that are tough, because certainly the downside of a Capricorn rising, if you have a difficult fourth house, usually, there's probably a lot of chaos. Probably very selfish parents, right? Where it truly was every man for himself. And if you didn't do things for yourself, you didn't take care of yourself, you didn't get anything. Right? That's, I would say, I don't want to say worst case scenario, but that's a more negative fourth house for a Capricorn rising. So what do? They, right? Work on themselves, they heal themselves. They do the things they need to do to kind of recognize, hey, this was what I grew up with. Do I want to do the same thing? No. So what do? Instead, they create an environment that's passionate. There's a passion for the home. Why? Because I didn't have that growing up. So they turn the negative Aries qualities to the more positive. And this is kind of the same thing for any negative house that you have. It doesn't have to just stay negative. You just have to work through the things that make it difficult. And this is kind of an aside, really, for this episode. But I wanted to point that out because even though we can grow up in a pretty rough home, it doesn't guarantee that just because our chart indicated that it's going to stay that way when we're older. You always have the opportunity to change the things that were there by what? Learning, healing, right? Understanding, okay, why did this happen? How can I do it differently? And then acting on that. So the fourth house in total is going to represent, right, our private self, our mind, our mental processing, the way we think about things, how we think about things, how we react to things and process that stuff. It's going to represent our private life, how we act when we're in private, when our guard is down, when we don't feel the stress and the worry and the pressure of the outside world. It's going to represent our private places, and most specifically, it's going to represent our home. And therefore, it's going to represent our family, both the family we grew up with as well as the family we create. It's going to represent our family life, and it's going to represent the family itself, and it's going to represent our lineage, our ancestors. Now, the fourth house, if we look at it in relation to the other houses, right? As I mentioned, it's in a square aspect to the first. So that naturally is going to imply there's tension, and this makes total sense, right? Because why? Well, the fourth house is representing your family and your family life growing up. Of course, that's a tense thing for the self. Your family is raising you. That is genuinely hard. It's hard for everybody. Every child has to go through that process of, okay, I'm either being cared for, I'm being ignored, or some mixture of the two, right? And that has varying levels of difficulty or whatnot. But in any case, no matter what, every child has to go through some level of tension growing up. So growing up, it's more tension from the fourth affecting you, the self. But as you age, then it becomes, okay, what am I doing that's going to alter, that's going to change where I'm living, right? The places I find as my home, the family that I have, the family that I create. So that square aspect is a source of natural tension that kind of is certainly more weighted from the fourth house to the first as we're young, and then to the fourth house from the first as we age. Since we're doing the square, the other square is going to be to the seventh, and this makes sense too. Seventh house represents partnerships or attachments, right? People we are close to. Well, if you're close to somebody and you create a family, right, that naturally is going to influence your home. You're naturally going to influence, right, that dynamic. The other thing is families tend to be opinionated on who you date, how you date, and things like that, or the people you associate with. That's going to be influenced by your family, or it's going to influence your family, right? Because it's either going to add to it or cause contention. And so the seventh house is also then in a tense aspect to the fourth. It's not as drastic, I think. I think the first and fourth house aspect is probably one of the most potent, just by nature of what those things represent. But the seventh is certainly, there's tension there too. That's going to constantly, right, apply pressure to, okay, I got to adjust. I've made changes because I've introduced this new person in my life, right, and so forth. We'll look at the other hard aspect, and then we'll move on to some of the easier ones. But let's look at the opposition. The 10th house, right? 10th house is actually pretty straightforward. It's your public life. If the fourth house is the most private place, the 10th house is going to represent the most public place. It's right? It's the top of the sky. So the 10th house is your public life. And as we know, you have to balance between your private and your public, right? What are you doing in private? What are you doing in public? And some people live to be seen, and some people shy away from that. And how you balance that's dependent on your own chart, how you want to go about life. But that's the opposition. There's tension there. You have to find a way to balance the two. And it's hard to introduce publicity into the home, right? Because that tends to interrupt your privacy, your private self. It can be destabilizing. Alternatively, if you are a homebody and ignore the public area of life, well, then you tend to what? Not have friends, not meet people, maybe not even go anywhere in your career. So you have to have that balance in terms of both, which is why it's an opposition. Oppositions are about balance and compromise. As far as the easy aspects, let's look at the trine, right? So the trine houses are going to be the 8th and the 12th. And at first glance, they seem kind of counterintuitive, because the 8th and the 12th are typically considered two of the very difficult houses. But if you look at what they represent, those three houses, the 4th, 8th, and 12th, they're all psychological houses. With the fourth, as I said, being your kind of conscious mind, thinking, processing. The eighth house is going to be it's not subconscious, but it's more like the repressed mind in a way. It's the parts of us that we tend to repress and to hide, right? Mentally. Sometimes it's subconscious, but it's stuff that tends to be just under the surface. It also is the house of mental crisis. So when you have mental crises, when you have psychological issues, right? Especially things that are issues you've repressed, that you've hidden, you've intentionally hidden because it's too dangerous to be those things. That's the eighth house. And so the trine then is because there's an easy flow, right? If the fourth house represents your family, how you grew up, how you were raised, the family is going to naturally influence the things you feel pressured to do or not do, the things you feel, hey, this isn't safe for me, right? I've had dangerous parents. I can't be this way, right? And that shows up then in the eighth house of things you tend to repress that tend to only come out in times of crisis. So there's a natural, easy flow there. And then alternatively, when you have and experience mental crises, right, what's going to happen? It's going to be, right, it's going to kind of naturally change how you think about things, how you process things, right? So they go hand in hand. That's why it's a trine relationship. I'd say the other aspect of that is the eighth house is going to represent inheritance and things of that nature, right? And if the fourth house is lineage, then it stands to reason that as the parents, the grandparents, as they age, as they die, because that's just what happens, right? As we age, they're going to have to do something with their possessions, with their own property. And so what do? They naturally pass it down. And so that's another relationship that's naturally pretty easy flowing, right? It goes from parent to child and so forth. The other of these psychological houses is going to be the 12th house. 12th house is kind of a mystery to a lot of people. A lot of people I seemingly have a hard time understanding it. I'm a very 12th housey person, but yeah, it's an interesting house. It's the house of hidden things. It's the house of the subconscious. Right? The eighth house, I said psychologically, it's things we tend to repress. So we tend to be aware of the issues and the muck and the murk that's in the eighth house, at least psychologically. The 12th house, we're not aware. It's hidden. It's stuff we don't understand about ourselves. It's subconscious issues. And the 12th house is going to have a lot in common with the moon in that sense. In other ways, not so much. But in that sense, it's going to have a lot of resonance with the moon dealing with subconscious things, which is a natural outflow, again, of what? Our family life, how we were raised. It's going to shape all those little quirks in terms of who we are and how we operate in our subconscious tics. They all flow together. They all naturally fit together. The other aspect of it is the 12th house is going to represent isolation and solitude and spirituality, right? And the fourth house representing what? Our private life, right? When you want to be private, what does that naturally mean? Well, typically you want to isolate. You want to be alone. And isolation is a 12th house thing. So it naturally flows then that when you are isolated, you can fall back into your private mind, your private conscious self. So that's the resonance between the 12th and the 4th, right? Is that isolation as well as the subconscious and how they kind of flow between the two. And the other thing, going back to the subconscious, is as you experience things, right? Stuff that's hidden in your subconscious that kind of bubbles up when you're triggered, or right when something kind of sparks those things, kind of wells up, and then it's like, okay, now I got to process this. I had this thought, I had this dream, I had this sudden response, this flood of emotion that where'd this come from? Right now I have to process it. I have to figure it out. And that's the way, again, how they kind of easily flow into each other. All right, let's talk about the sextiles. The sextiles are going to be the second house and the sixth house. It's kind of these are interesting ones. The second house is going to be in a sextile. Sextile, if you remember, is an opportunity for something, right? It's an opportunity. It's not an easy flow like the trine, but more of it's there, but you don't always have to take it. And what is the opportunity? Well, we talked about this in the second house, right? Second house is support systems. So if you have a good family, they are going to be supportive, whether it's the family you grew up with or it's the family you create, right? So that's the opportunity. There's opportunity for support when you have family, when you grow family, when you pass things down through your family. The other aspect of it is going to be possessions, which is, again, kind of a natural outflow of, hey, if you buy property, right, you buy a home, you're naturally going to put things in your home, which is, again, naturally conducive to resources, owning things. So that's the other connection that they have. The other side, though, is the sixth house. Sixth house is one of the three kind of tough houses, are the sixth, eighth, and the 12th typically. Sixth house is a hard house because it's the house of conflict. It's also the house of work. And it's the house of servitude. Servitude implies you serve or someone serving you. And if we think about what a family is about, right? What are parents? They're servants. Servants to their children. At least they should be. Broken homes have parents who are not servants, whether because of their own choices or because circumstances don't allow them to be, right? We're poor, so the father has to work, the mother has to work, right? Can't be home for the kid, that kind of thing, right? There's certainly circumstances where it's not their own choosing, but by and large, a parent should be a servant to their kid. Why? Because raising kids is hard. I have twin 3-year-olds. It is hard work. They're needy. They're a time sink. But they need that, right? They need the help. They're children. They're babies, right? It requires effort. It requires work. It requires service. And so the natural dynamic then, the natural opportunity for starting a family is having something you now have to serve. And think of it this way too, from partnership perspective. Say you get married and don't have kids. Or maybe you just have a long-time partner, even if you don't get married. What's the dynamic of good relationships? You're serving each other. You're taking care of each other. That takes work to make it last, to make it go. So the nature of the fourth house then has a nice connection to the house of service, the house of work. Lastly, let's look at the aversion houses. So the two that are right next to the fourth house, the third and the fifth, right? The third house, we talked about this last week. It's local space, whereas the fourth house is more private. And so there's certainly resonance there, especially because the third house is going to deal with our siblings and extended family. But it's not we don't typically live with all of our extended family, right? It's something else. You keep them separate. Not always, but usually you try and keep the extended family separate, right? And so there's kind of this disresonance there where it's like, well, it's kind of its own thing. The other thing too is you don't allow the whole neighborhood into your house, right? You keep them separate. They're still in the outside world a little bit. And so that's kind of the main disresonance there. In the fifth house deals with fun, enjoyments, passions, creativity, and children, right? And romance, because romance is what leads to children, theoretically. But the fifth house has a disresonance with the fourth because, again, you shouldn't be being romantic in your own home, right? That comes first as you create a new family. So there's disresonance there. Now, enjoyments, passions, right? Those are certainly things you can do with your family, maybe kind of come as a result of how you were raised. But ultimately, fifth house is going to represent your own personal passions, the things you want to do, right? The things you want to enjoy. And families are different. As much as we are all kind of the same in our own little family, we all have our different preferences. We all have our different ways of wanting to do things. And so there's disresonance there. You also, again, you don't have children with your own family, hopefully. The other houses that are going to be inversion are going to be the 9th house, which is going to be an interesting one, and the 11th. So let's look at the 9th house first. 9th house is going to deal with how we grow ourselves. It's going to deal with our worldview, our belief systems, how we get out into the broader world. Well, if the 4th house is our private life, our private home, our mental processing, right? That's not something you typically want to mix with going out into the world. It's going to be related in some way. There's certainly going to be some influence between your worldview and your private self, but right, your mental processing. But by and large, your mental processing isn't centered on, right, what you believe. You don't change how you think about things based on what you believe. You change how you think about things based on your psychological influences, which can be shaped, certainly, by your belief systems. But it's kind of an awkward, it's not really a direct flow. It's not really a direct fit. The other thing is the 9th house is getting out into the world to try new experiences, which implies you meet new people, see new things, read new things, explore, experience, right? Because it's about growth. And doing that is completely disresonant with what? Being private, being in the home, having a family. It's not to say you can't have a family that goes out and explores and does things together, but it's not the basis of a family, right? You can't have a solid, stable family that's oriented around constant change, constant growth, constant moving around the world. It's not a stable atmosphere. The 4th house, more than any other house, is hopefully trying to be stable. It's where we ground ourselves. The other aversion house is going to be, or the last I should say, is going to be the 11th. The 11th represents our social groups, our friends, our families, or sorry, not families, our friends, our social groups, our followers. It also represents our hopes and dreams and the kind of things we get as a result of our public life. And that's obviously very much in opposition, or not opposition, but disresonance with the home, the private life, right? If I'm trying to be private, I don't want everybody in the world coming in and looking at that, right? Whether it's my home, right, my own little private shelter, recluse, whatever it is, my own thoughts, right, my own thinking, my own processing. I don't want the world watching that. And you don't want the world raising your family. That's going to make it really hard. And so that's the nature, or the disresonance, I should say, between the 11th and the 4th. So that's the 4th house. Again, just to sum up, it's going to represent the home, the family, our private self, our private life, our mental processing, our emotional processing, how we think about things, how we operate, and kind of our, I don't want to say underlying drives and motivations, but it certainly influences the way we go out into the world, why we do certain things, because of how we were raised and how we think. So that's everything. In the next episode, we'll look at the 5th house. So I am a practicing astrologer. If you would like a reading, you can reach out to me. My email is james@jdastrology.com. Alternatively, you can just go to my website, jdastrology.com, and reach out to me there. But I do personal readings, birth chart readings. I also do synastry, which is relationships. So if you're interested in that, I can look at a relationship for you. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we will be back next week. Thanks for listening.